Osiris.
This podcast is in the Loop, the Legion of Osiris podcasts. What does that mean? Osiris is a community of great music and culture podcasts. If you like this one, go check out others at osirispod.com and get in the loop. Osiris is partnered with Relics magazine at relics.com.
Welcome to RTN Theology. I'm your host, Bob Crawford. On this episode, we welcome historian and author John Fea to discuss his book, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? An Introduction. John is a professor at Messiah College in Grantham, Pennsylvania, and he has spent his career looking at this question, dissecting it, trying to understand the different ways it's been framed throughout our history. I think a lot of his insights will surprise you. Then our very own Ian Skotte goes searching for religious artifacts while backpacking across Europe. A little over a week ago, a gunman armed with a AR-15 assault rifle walked into Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, and killed 17 teachers and students and injured 15 others. As news of the tragedy made its way across television screens and social media, calls for thoughts and prayers went out to the victims, their families, and members of the Parkland community. But within hours, other memes began popping up on social media. Charges that called out thoughts and prayers as being useless and insincere. On their website, CNN's A.J. Willingham pointed out the phenomenon of semantic satiation, which is when a word or phrase is repeated so often that it loses its meaning. Willingham points out that thoughts and prayers has become a joke to many because it's tied to the repetition of mass shootings that have become all too common in the U.S. The Parkland High School shooting is the 18th mass shooting of 2018. It's only February. As we are becoming more desensitized to the images associated with the brutality of mass killings, we are also becoming desensitized to expressions of condolence, like thoughts and prayers. When something tragic happens to someone I know, I respond by letting them know, either in person, on the phone, by text, card, email, that I am keeping them in my thoughts and prayers. And I mean it. I'm going to pray for them. I'm going to think about them, reflect on their tragedy, and in some way, I hope, by mourning their loss, I suffer with them. I understand that we are all sick and tired of this new reality show where someone takes an assault rifle into a school, church, theater, or even a concert, fires off a clip of 30, 60, even 100 rounds. We watch videos of the trapped fearing for their lives, others fleeing to safety, some covered in the blood of the victims, who are victims just because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. We ask our political leaders to do something, and they pay us lip service as they wait for the news cycle to change, because it always changes. I agree that now is the time for action. But now is also the time for thoughts and prayers, in moments of silence. Now is the time to suffer with those who mourn. Now is the time for hugs and words of love expressed to those we love. Now is the time to let the pain reach deep inside of us, so together we can remember that we are all human, and that in times like these, of great suffering and loss, we all need to send and receive thoughts and prayers. Our guest today is John Fea. He's the author of Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? A Historical Introduction. He's a professor of American history and the chair of the history department at Messiah College in Grantham, Pennsylvania, where he's taught since 2002. His forthcoming book, Believe Me, The Evangelical Road to Donald Trump, will be available on June 30th, 2018. He's also the host of the podcast and blog, The Way of Improvement Leads Home, and I'm so grateful to have him as my guest today on RTN Theology. John Fea, welcome.
Thanks. It's great to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
Well, this could be the shortest show we've ever done because there's really one question here. Was America founded as a Christian nation?
It's a question I've been asked almost every interview I do for the last 6-7 years. In some ways, that's the first question that's asked. It's a complicated question. And my book that I wrote on this in 2011, and it actually has come out in the second edition last year, is really examining this question from a historical perspective. So the subtitle of the book is An Historical Introduction. So I'm not particularly interested in the book in the question of whether we are a Christian nation today or, the contemporary politics surrounding this. I'm much more interested in what the founding fathers believed about the relationship between Christianity and the American founding. So in some ways, and I often say this, in some ways, the title of my book, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation, is in some ways a bad historical title. And what I mean by that is, actually, the original title was probably something boring, like, I can't remember now, something like Religion and the American Founding or something. And my editors at Westminster, Knox Press, said we need something a little sexier, it's going to catch the attention a little bit more. So what we ended up doing is we ended up taking a question that's been debated probably in a serious, it's been debated since the 1970s, really, in a serious way in our so-called culture wars, and kind of superimpose that. The title kind of suggests that we're superimposing that back on the 18th century, when many of the founders were not debating this point. So the question, was America founded as a Christian nation, is very much a modern question. And it's not a question the founders were asking. So it's complicated and it's complex. But when you think about it historically, I try to teach my students history is very complex, and it often doesn't conform to the kind of boxes we want to put it in the present.
And I looked at it as kind of tongue-in-cheek, right? Really, we all know, everyone who listens to this show knows how complex that question is and how fraught with confusion it is, and how it's like, and you kind of say this early in the book, like if you know how you feel, like most of the time you'll go out and give a talk and people already know how they feel about the answer. They already have the answer that they believe. And so you challenge us. You challenge us to, what do you say, history is risk and willingness? Did I quote that correctly?
I think risk and wisdom.
Risk and wisdom. You're trying to get us out of our comfort zones. What I love about this, I read a lot of history books. You got to love a history book that starts out with a primer about what historians do. Yeah. I mean, so tell us about the 5 C's.
Yeah, sure. Again, a little bit of this kind of history behind the history of this my writing on this. One of the things is I went around and I spoke and did radio interviews and podcast interviews about Was America Founded as a Christian Nation, the book. One of the things that I noticed was, in some ways, yes, there was the politicization of the past. We were taking our political agendas in the present. I think both the left and the right do this at times, and superimposing them on the past. But at the heart of kind of this was not necessarily as much as sort of, what the founders believed about religion and Christianity and so on, because you could pull out quotes. You could find the founders saying that, Christianity is important to the good of the republic. You could also pull out quotes from founding fathers who say that Christianity is a false religion, or they don't believe in the sort of core essential doctrines of the Christian faith. So, to me, what I was, as I began to sort of think more deeply about this, really there was a problem here about in our culture, I think, and especially among some Christians, but generally about how to think historically, right? How does the past relate to the present? And I felt like a lot of even political pundits and people you see on cable news and so forth were kind of ill-informed about how this works. So I wrote a second book, a book right after this called Why Study History, in which I kind of tried to unpack this. And in both, in that book, and I think in the Christian America book as well, I borrowed from these historians who said that at the key to this kind of historical thinking, the kind of thinking that is absolutely essential for living together in a democratic life and understanding the relationships between the past and the present, are these 5 C's, and they are, the idea that human beings, and we already mentioned this in this interview, right? The complexity of the past, the complexity of human beings, the idea that historians are always looking for the causes of why things happen. They're not just interested in facts and dates and so forth and memorization, like some of you have maybe some of your listeners have nightmares from their high school history class, right, where they memorize all these things. But we're also thinking about, causation. Why do things happen the way they did? Another one of the C's is change over time. I always like to quote the historian Gordon Wood, who said that historians are always telling a story that begins with point A and ends with point B, and point B is always closer to the present. So it's historians who are, where we live and we work and we kind of have our being is between point A and B, right? And the kind of messiness of change as it happens over time. Then you have contingency, which is probably one of the more complicated of the C's, but, the idea that every event is contingent upon another event, and history is not about these kind of macro sort of theological or philosophical systems that say, like fate or providence or something like that, but rather we as historians, by our vocation, by our calling as historians, we are talking about human experiences and the choices that human beings make. So there's a certain sense in which historians, even if they do believe in these larger macro philosophical systems, are always writing and talking and teaching about free will and actions and human actions. So I'm trying to think here. We got contingency, we got causation, change over time, complexity, and context, of course, context. Yeah, so, again, the era in which a particular event took place, context is always important for understanding interpreting any kind of human experience. So, I'm a big believer in the idea that these 5 C's are not just helpful in a history classroom or for those who like to read a lot of history or, those kinds of things. But these are the kind of skills that the study of the past teaches that are also applicable to our lives and the way we think about the world today. In an age of fake news, in an age where, we are being bombarded with so many different messages and we're not quite sure, what's true and what's not. I think these 5 C's, thinking in this way, can at least help us to make sense of the sort of cacophony of voices that we hear over and over again in our culture, and help us to make sense of how to process all of those voices.
It's a complex question, but it's also people in, culture, they treat it often as a very simplistic question. Was America founded as a Christian nation? I don't know how many people have come up to me or have said to me, friends, or acquaintances who've said at one point or another, well, if we could just get back to our Christian roots,
Right.
it's a beat, we'd be okay. But
Right.
it's really like, where does it begin, right?
Yeah.
Was it the writing of the Constitution is when we became a nation? Was it the forming of the Continental Congress? For me, I like to think about it in terms of when the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Jamestown colonies, right, as being
Sure.
an early beginning to the nation that we have today. But they were very different, right? It wasn't the guys who came to Jamestown had different hopes, dreams, goals, motivations than the families who came over and settled in Massachusetts, and what is now today is Boston. Can you talk about the differences between Jamestown and Massachusetts Bay?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just quickly to go back to the way you initially sort of began the question. There's a lot of attempt at, I think a lot of the way in which history is used, particularly by Christians on the right who want America to be a Christian nation, is this sense of nostalgia, right? We need to get back to this golden age that, in some ways, probably didn't exist in the way in which, that golden age is being employed in our political debate today. One of the big questions that I try to address, as you just brought up, is this question of when was America founded, right? And I tend to distinguish the kind of founding of the United States from the sort of planting of British colonies in the New World. I mean, in America. I mean, we're talking about 150 year separation between the so-called founding of the United States of America, if we were to date that, say, at 1776, and sort of the arrival of the first British settlers to establish a permanent settlement in Jamestown in 1607. Then you have New England Puritans or New England separatists, Pilgrims, coming in 1620, and then a decade later you have Puritans coming and creating the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So I think, even if you were to say that America was somehow founded in the early 17th century, even then there's no kind of unified way of thinking about that. The Jamestown colony, and again, we have to be careful with this because I don't want to suggest that the Jamestown colony was completely secular. There were certainly, archaeology and so forth has uncovered, all kinds of things related to the religious life of the colony. But when we're thinking about the culture or the ethos of the Jamestown and early Virginia colony, the ethos is really not shaped by Christian faith as much as it is by economic motivations, maybe even greed, the attempt to find gold, and if gold's not available, which the Virginia settlers quickly realized, then you need something to grow in what is often referred to as a mercantile economy that is going to, be the same thing as gold. In other words, you need to get other nations to give up some of their gold in order to buy this good that they want. And that happens to be tobacco, the staple crop of tobacco. So I think tobacco is really what drives the Virginia colony. Very much self-interested, very much about economic acquisitiveness, gaining money, so forth, mammon, so if you want to put it that way. And I think whatever religion exists there always sort of defers to that larger economic self-interested ethos. It's very different in New England, both the Plymouth colony founded in 1620, but also Massachusetts Bay founded in the 1630s, 1630, the so-called City on a Hill, John Winthrop. These are clearly attempts to establish a Christian civilization, a Protestant civilization. If you want to break that down further, even a Calvinist Protestant civilization, in which the laws of the land are built upon biblical ideals, in which power in these societies is invested with people who have had conversion experiences. This is one attempt at creating a Christian civilization. So you could technically make an argument that at the time of the planting in New England, they were trying to create a Christian society. Then you have to, you also have to measure what kind of Christian society they were going to create. I mean, you could, is it a particularly Christian society when you are basically hanging Quakers in Boston Common because they do not agree with your theological position that that sort of animates the life of the state? Does a Christian society do what it does to Native American populations in New England? And so on and so forth. So even this early attempt in New England to create a Christian society often it does have some problems as well when you put what they're trying to do up against, say, the teachings of the Bible or the teachings of the Christian Church. So it's very complicated, and I often hear politicians who will say, back this, when the Pilgrims came over, they established a Christian nation, and it's just really, really bad. It's just really, really bad history. Now, again, were the Pilgrims trying to create a Christian civilization? Yes. When a politician references the Pilgrims and says they're trying to create a Christian society, they're right. But that's where the historical thinking skills come in, right? Because they don't consider the larger context, the complexity, the fact that change over time has taken place. All of these things factor in.
I think it's interesting with Massachusetts Bay and the Pilgrims is that they had trouble with the second generation and third generation Puritans, because it's like, and it's a classic story, right? The kids weren't as into it as the adults, and you couldn't, and in order to be a voting member and a participating member in society and a church member, you had to profess a conversion experience, and the younger generations weren't able to do that. So then they had to modify what a conversion experience was and created like a half conversion experience. And it's like the kids are always ruining everything.
Yeah, right. The next generation is always worse. I mean, this is what historians call the declension model, the decline, right? I mean, there's one historian in the 1960s named Darrett Ruttman. I always quote him because I love his phrase. He says that the pure Puritan, utopian kind of city on a hill society was in a state of decline from the moment that the Puritans stepped off the boat in Boston. It's very hard to sustain this kind of society, when you also have this kind of really robust view, if you're a Puritan, of kind of human sin too. So there's some interesting scholarship on this. I mean, there's the famous Puritan Perry Miller made a similar argument to the one you just made, and I think it's largely correct, right? The halfway covenant, these attempts to kind of keep their special relationship with God. The Puritans believed that their society was a new Israel, and rather than using circumcision as the entrance into that special relationship with God, like the Israelites did, they saw infant baptism as their entrance in. So you still needed to be converted and saved in order to vote and in order to participate in government. But the covenant with God, the special relationship they had with God, you entered into that. That was sustained only by more and more people being baptized. The problem is you can't baptize your kid unless you yourself are saved and a church member, right? So fewer and fewer people are getting saved, which means fewer and fewer people are able to baptize their children, which means the covenant then is weakening. So you have to come up with some way to allow non-church members to still baptize their kids, and that becomes the halfway covenant. Now, there is some evidence to suggest, which is really interesting. There's a historian named Harry Stout, Miller's view. One of them is a Yale University historian named Harry Stout, who wrote a book called The New England Soul. And there he suggested that actually from the pulpits, the Sunday morning pulpits, the unpublished sermons that preachers preached, you still see this kind of covenant relationship with God that exists all the way up through the Revolution in Puritan New England. But it's in the sort of more public sermons that you see the decline. So even that gets a little messy and sort of complicated as historians kind of explore this a little bit more.
So why don't we move on a little bit in our chronology?
Sure.
Here's a question or a statement that people say, well, all the founders were Christians.
Yeah. Again, it's a little more complicated than that. Again, it depends how you define Christianity. You have someone like, say, Thomas Jefferson, who rejected a belief in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, rejected the belief that Jesus Christ was God, rejected the idea that the Bible was inspired. For me, it's hard to mesh that with sort of those beliefs with sort of traditional Christianity. Jefferson always believed he was somewhat of a Christian, but clearly his core beliefs were not in line with historic Orthodox Christianity. You could make the same case for someone like Ben Franklin or John Adams. John Adams, who rejected the doctrine of the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. All of these, a lot of these founding fathers would have rejected core Christian beliefs. There were others, people like John Witherspoon, who was the only minister to sign the Declaration of Independence, president of Princeton University, or it's known then as the College of New Jersey. You have people like Samuel Adams. You have Patrick Henry, John Jay. These people, would probably identify with, even today, modern evangelicals in their Orthodox Christian beliefs. So again, I always tell my students, especially when you're talking about religion, be careful of lumping all the founding fathers together and saying the founding fathers all believed this. They were all deists, or they were all atheists, or they were all Christians, or they were all secular, because they vary from person to person. Now, another important point to make is just because we tend to equate the personal beliefs of the founding fathers with their views on the role that religion should play in society. And what I mean by that is, let's take somebody like John Adams, for example. John Adams despised the Calvinists of Puritan New England that were his ancestors. He just thought that they were, they took the Bible too literally. They were far too dogmatic in their beliefs. He rejected the Trinity, so by the end of his life, he was a Unitarian. But John Adams also firmly believed that government money, tax money, should go to pay in Massachusetts for an established church, the Congregational Church, because he believed that Christianity especially, was absolutely essential to helping create a moral order in society. Thomas Jefferson believed something along these lines. So did Benjamin Franklin, despite the fact that they themselves would have rejected Orthodox Christian beliefs. You have to remember that the founding fathers were not theologians. They weren't pastors. They weren't missionaries, right? Their purpose was to build a republic. And if religious belief could help them build a strong and moral and virtuous, as they would have described it, republic, then they would find it useful. I like to say, if there was some kind of religion that did not provide a foundation for a good moral republic, perhaps a religious form of Christianity that was prophetic or criticized the republic, I'm not sure the founding fathers would have had much use for that kind of religion, because they were really not. They really thought about religion in a kind of utilitarian sense in terms of public religion. Now, again, they all had their own individual convictions.
So when we think about founding documents, the Declaration of Independence mentions God, but the Constitution does not. A big argument that comes up from time to time is whether the First Amendment of the Constitution gives us freedom of religion or freedom from religion. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It's used by both sides, right?
Yeah, yeah. The First Amendment is, my take on this is that the First Amendment is it doesn't give us a lot of guidance when it comes to all of these contemporary questions that we debate on in the culture wars today. We've had to rely upon the courts over the years, especially in the 20th century, to interpret what the First Amendment means. But, in its historical context, the First Amendment, and this is why I'm somewhat of a little bit of an opponent of this idea of original intent, because, we could say, as far as we know about the original intent of the authors of the First Amendment, James Madison and others, they were opposed to a religious establishment. There will be no state church, right? No religion will have privilege over other religions. And then they said that, people are allowed to exercise their religion freely without government interference. Now, that does not necessarily help us that much in terms of understanding what to do when there's a Ten Commandments display in the courthouse. Should that or shouldn't that be there? Or whether you can have a manger scene during Christmas on public land, or whether you can have prayer at a football game. The First Amendment just really isn't clear as to what that means. So it's been the courts who have interpreted this for us. I think the most significant court case on the First Amendment came in 1947, the so-called Everson versus Board of Education case, in which, I won't go into the details of the case, but in that case, Justice Hugo Black coined the famous phrase that there is a wall of separation between church and state, and that wall of separation should be high and impregnable. Now, that court case, to some extent, was applied in 1962 and 1963 when prayer and Bible reading, mandatory prayer and Bible reading, were removed from public schools, and it's been applied in multiple other cases since then. So, the Supreme Court in 1947 applied the 14th Amendment to church-state issues, interpreted the First Amendment through the 14th Amendment, and concluded that there is a separation of church and state. Now, there are some, I think, legitimate conservative scholars who argue that that was wrongly decided. There's a lot of also crazy conservative scholars who don't really understand the context at all. But there's a lot of good conservative scholars who would say, the 1947 Everson case was based upon the 1802 letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, in which he said that there is a wall of separation between church and state, and it really doesn't. It's not really an interpretation of the First Amendment. It's an interpretation of that letter. So this gets into, again, a bunch of different debates, huge debates over this. But yeah, I mean, if we were to abide by the Supreme Court ruling in 1947, which is still sort of on the books and still operates as sort of the definitive case in separation of church and state issues, then this has been largely decided, and it is we have this. It's hard to say that religious symbols and so forth should be present in public spaces. Originally the First Amendment was designed to protect the church, not the state, right? So the church, we're going to keep government out of the church to protect the purity of the church, so that the church can do what it does without government interference. And that's in some ways the way Protestants have always understood it. So in the 1947 case, evangelical Protestants were strongly in favor and in support of the Everson decision, the wall of separation, because the case was about government funding to Catholic schools who wanted the government to pay for their busing. And the Protestants didn't like the Catholics, so they said, we can't be funding Catholics. This is a Protestant country. So when the Supreme Court said that there was a separation between church and state, and that is high and impregnable, the Protestants said, you better believe that's true. Right? We affirm separation of church and state because we don't want money going to Catholics. Of course, this would come back to haunt evangelicals in 62 and 63 with the prayer and Bible reading cases when it was applied against them. So, again, it gets very messy.
Yeah, that Catholic versus Protestant, I mean, that's a whole episode in itself. I've actually been consciously staying away from the Catholic questions because we don't have that kind of time. I wish we had 17 hours. That could be great. Let's move on to the Civil War briefly. This summer, I read Mark Noll's book, Civil War as Theological Crisis.
Excellent book.
Excellent book. Everyone should read it. Your book kind of says, it was the Civil War was about deciding which kind of Christian nation we would be.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't obviously entirely about that. I think the Civil War was really about the issue of slavery, but slavery was wed. This Christian nation question is bound up with this whole question of slavery. I think the North in the Civil War, we tend to think, immediately say, I ask my students, why do you think the North thought they were a Christian nation? And most of my students will respond right away because they oppose slavery, right? And that eventually is what happened. Once the war became a war about slavery, the North began to claim, well, God must be on our side because we're fighting against this evil institution. But earlier in the war, and really you see this carrying on throughout the course of the war, one of the reasons as well that the North thought that God was on their side was because of this idea of the Union, this idea that somehow the Constitution and the creation of the Constitution and the establishment of a very strong federal government was a kind of divine event. It was God kind of endorsing the sacredness of the Union. And thus anyone who was going to challenge the sacredness of this solid union that was created in 1787 and ratified in 1789 by all the states, anyone who challenges this then, is sort of challenging the will of God, challenging God's sort of special relationship with the United States. Now, the South, on the other hand, they argued that America, or I should say the Confederacy, was a Christian nation because they were following the teachings of the Bible on the issue of slavery. So you have this sort of strange argument, but, it's at least strange in terms of our present day, that the South and the Confederacy is being more Christian and is more aligned with the will of God because the Bible does not condemn slavery and we uphold slavery, right? So we are more Christian because we have slaves. There's this wonderful moment in the this is not wonderful, historically wonderful, but there's this moment when they're writing the Confederate Constitution and they add these words in there, Almighty God. In other words, they defer to Almighty God in the preamble of the Confederate Constitution. And the Confederates are quick to note that we put God in our Constitution, while the North does not have God in their Constitution. So this is a clear sign that God is going to be on our side in the war. This bothered Northern preachers, especially, this argument that the South made. This bothered them so much that they tried to actually start an organization called the National Reform Association. I always say it's the NRA before the actual NRA, the gun NRA. And the whole purpose of the National Reform Association was to add a Christian amendment to the United States Constitution to say that we are a Christian nation. And it was born directly out of many ministers who were upset that why does the Confederate Constitution have God in it, but we don't, right? So in some ways, yes, Noll is right. I agree with Noll on this, that these debates over slavery and states' rights were very much tied into the idea of who was on God's side. right? And thus Lincoln comes in his second inaugural address in March of 1865 and says, both sides pray to the same God, right? Both sides invoke the Bible, and claim to have divine authority. But then in that wonderful phrase, Lincoln says, but the Almighty has his own purposes, right? Appealing to the kind of mystery of God, appealing to the kind of verse we read in, say, 1 Corinthians 13:12 in the Bible, right? We see through a glass dimly. We don't know what God is doing, so don't try to invoke him to justify your cause. And then Lincoln has this wonderful argument where he says, our hands are all dirty. We're all soiled. Our hands are all soiled from slavery. 250 years of unrequited toil, is his word. So let's not judge lest ye be judged. There's so much rich biblical imagery in that second inaugural address.
And in another Mark Knoll book, The History of Christianity in America and
United States and Canada.
Yes,
good book.
Yeah, great book. And he kind of touches on how Lincoln had made this tremendous spiritual growth throughout the period of the Civil War, how he personally, his personal faith, his personal relationship with God just grew, and how he really came to lean on God and prayed to God to understand his role in the great national conflict.
I think that's a good point. I do think that Lincoln, there's been other. I think Knoll would agree with me when I say that Lincoln never really embraces Christianity, never really embraces the idea that this God incarnated himself in the form of a human being and died on the cross for man's sins. But certainly he sees this God as an active force. His God is an active force in world affairs and politics and so forth. And I think Knoll is right when he suggests that, Lincoln leans upon that God, especially later in his life.
So you've been so gracious with your time, but I can't let you go without talking about, believe me, the evangelical road to Donald Trump. It kind of, this conversation leads to this road, right?
Yeah. I think what I'm trying to get at in this book, it'll be out later in the late spring. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to approach the 2016 election and the rise of Donald Trump as a historian, and to ask, what is it about the history of American evangelicals that led 81% of them to vote for Donald Trump? So that is the crux of sort of what I'm trying to unpack. And so there's a lot of history in the book. I would not be telling the truth if I said that the book, unlike any other book that I've written, my 5 previous books, I'd be saying this book is a little bit different because I do kind of speak as well as an evangelical Christian who is trying to sort of call my fellow evangelicals to think a little more deeply about their relationship to Donald Trump. But the book is largely sort of a history book, but it does have a little bit of a sort of political angle to it. What I'm trying to understand is the way evangelicals have thought about politics in the last 8 years and 10 years, the last 50 years, the last even 200 or 300 years, and trying to think about the way in which fear and power and nostalgia, I mentioned this before, those 3 things have really driven the way evangelicals have approached political life, and in many ways drove them straight into the arms of Donald Trump. So I don't want to tip my hand too much. The book will be out again in June. I would suggest, I'm often blogging about the things in my book. If people want to check out my blog at thewayofimprovement.com, and get out there and pre-order a copy of it too. Go down to Amazon and buy yourself a copy in advance.
I will do that today, and please plug your Twitter handle because I love following you on Twitter. What is that?
Sure. Yeah, sure. My handle is at John JOHNFEA 1, John Fea 1. I'm mostly trying to bring some historical perspective to contemporary events, but again, I wouldn't be telling the truth if I also didn't sort of sometimes get political and so forth. But I'm trying to think as a Christian. I'm trying to think Christianly about the world, about the past, about the relationship between the past and the present, about politics and so forth. So yeah, I'd love it if you could follow me and see what we're doing on Twitter.
So one last question for you, and I'll try to make it brief. When Trump was elected, we were all shocked by it. I imagined at this point we would have two Republican parties and a Democratic Party. We would have there would be a split, and it's not happened. I mean, even the ones who have had somewhat profiles and courage, Bob Corker and Jeff Flake, they make speeches, they make statements, but they have, and in fact, in the past couple of weeks, really fallen in line. Everyone, it is now the party of Trump. What about evangelicals? I mean, what is going to happen to the church, or what do you see happening to the church?
Yeah. Well, I think your assessment is correct. I think when you really get down to it, most Republicans on issues of policy agree with most of what Trump's doing. Now, you're going to have debates over the wall, and you're going to have debates over immigration, but in terms of tax cuts and moral issues, social, abortion and those kinds of things, most Republicans are going to be on board with Trump. Mike, I have a concern about the way evangelicals are responding to Trump. Now, again, 81% of American evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. That's a complicated number in the sense that not all evangelicals voted for Donald Trump because they like Donald Trump, or that they tolerate him, or I'm sure some have maybe had regrets about voting for Donald Trump. But there is a hardcore evangelical group. They're led by people like Robert Jeffress, the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Dallas, Jerry Falwell Jr., the president of Liberty University, and others. I call them the court evangelicals because they like to show up.
Yes, you do.
They like to show up every now and then at the king's court and flatter him without speaking truth to power. I think there's this hard-line group of people. Tony Perkins has recently come out. We're talking here in January of 2018. So Tony Perkins recently said that he wanted to give Donald Trump a mulligan, as he put it, for his relationship with a porn star that happened 10 or 11, 12 years ago.
But John, who else gets the mulligan? Who else gets the mulligan?
Yeah.
I mean, would Barack Obama have gotten a mulligan? Did Bill Clinton get a mulligan? I mean, he did politically.
This is the sort of kind of hypocrisy that I see in this hardline group of evangelicals. One of the things that I've traced on my blog, but I also will talk about in the Believe Me book, is the way in which many of these exact same people had back in the 1990s said that Bill Clinton was incapable of being president because of his immoral character, but yet they give Trump a pass. So what I worry about as an evangelical is the way in which the witness of evangelicals in the world. I mean, if you're an evangelical, one of the things that you hold dear is your ability to share your faith with other people, and to have that opportunity to do that, to share the so-called good news of the gospel. And we're beginning to see more and more examples of, say, missionaries saying it's much harder to do our work with Trump in charge, making all these statements about people from Africa and El Salvador and Haiti. It's becoming more and more difficult for evangelicals to share their faith, with other people in regular conversation, because you always now have to have this initial step where you say, the other person says, "Well, are you a Trump supporter?" And that's going to hurt your cause. So I think Trump ultimately is going to hurt in the long run the witness of the gospel. And I think when evangelicals turn towards power, and they turn towards this kind of power politics, they want to be in control. They want to pass their views on other people and make other people conform to their views. This kind of political power does not mesh very well with a suffering Savior who died on the cross in an incredible political act, ushering in a new kind of kingdom, right? He dies to usher in a kingdom. This is not what Christianity is all about. I've been recently reading, I've been teaching a class at my church on politics, and I was recently reading a great book by a University of Virginia sociologist. You may be familiar with him, James Davison Hunter. And the book is called To Change the World. And what Hunter has this incredible line. I posted it on my blog. You can go on the blog. The last couple of days I posted it, in which he said, when Christians pursue political power, right, and try to win the culture through politics, it's going to lead to quote unquote bizarre turns in who they're going to sort of get into bed with. And it's ultimately going to hurt the cause of Christianity in the world. But it's fascinating. Hunter wrote this in 2010. He talks about Christians pursuing power and the bizarre turns that happen, when this takes place. If there's anything that hasn't been more bizarre, is Christians, evangelical Christians, supporting a man like Donald Trump. At least that's the way I look at it.
Thank you so much, John Fea. You've been so gracious with your time. The books are Was America Founded as a Christian Nation and coming out in June, Believe Me, The Evangelical Road to Donald Trump. Please order them both today. Thank you so much, John.
Hey, it's a lot of fun. Anytime.
Oh, what can I know when all I can see is life playing tricks on everything that I believe? Well, youth, they grow old, their young passions die. Only those dreams could ever change the course of time. Like when I heard the words of that man from Jerusalem, who went to his grave to show us the way. That way should set us free. There's a people filled with greed. We'll lock our doors and hoard the light and leave our neighbors with their needs. I captured the smile of a starving young child, while overfed saints frowned at me from the choir. And the old, they grow young as they march before their graves. They'll cry for love, and love cries back, you're too late. 'Cause when you hear the words of my friend from Jerusalem, who went to his grave, show us the way. That way should set us free. But as a Judas in you and me, who speaks of love and kisses cold and leaves the dirt on his brother's feet. Like when you heard the words of my friend from Jerusalem, who went to his grave to show us the way. That way should set us free. But there's a Judas in you and me, who who speaks of love and kisses cold and leaves the dirt on his brother's feet.
Roughly about 15 years ago, my best friend and I got the chance to backpack across Europe. Thanks to our Eurail passes, we made our way across the continent. We toured the home of golf in Scotland, crossed the legendary Tower Bridge in London, ate waffles in Belgium, and spread a few germs while kissing the Blarney Stone in Ireland. While most of the memories from that trip seem like they've gotten jumbled together, one particular memory has always stood out. On one of our many day trips, we hopped on one of the early trains out of Brussels toward Europe's Venice of the North. Bruges is known as one of the most well-preserved medieval towns in all of the world. It's also been recognized for its production of lace, its canals, and the Basilica of the Holy Blood. According to the popular website and book of the same title, Atlas Obscura, following Jesus' crucifixion, using a piece of cloth, Joseph of Arimathea wiped blood from the body of Christ. That same cloth was then kept safe in the Holy Land until the Second Crusade, when Jerusalem's king Baldwin III gave it to his brother-in-law, the Count of Flanders. It's believed he then took the relic where it sits in the upper chapel of the basilica, still unopened to this day. From as early as I can remember, I've been fascinated by religious artifacts. I'd much rather watch Indiana Jones go looking for the Cup of Christ, the Ark of the Covenant, than messing with some mystical stones.
You chose poorly.
Most of my fascination comes from items closely associated with Jesus of Nazareth. Things like the Holy Grail, remnants of the cross, or St. Peter's remains, which lie under the church that bears his name in Vatican City. However, there are those seeking fame and fortune who have attempted to sell and exploit items they claim to be the real deal. I should point out that it's not my goal to prove or disprove the authenticity of religious artifacts. Instead, I want to learn the story behind these items, because you never know where they may appear.
Welcome back. A minor theft might have turned into a major religious discovery.
Take the painting allegedly stolen from a man's home in the mountains of East Tennessee.
It's like a story ripped from a Hollywood screenplay. A small road in the mountains of Tennessee, a living room in a motorhome, and a 150-year-old painting.
The stolen item is believed to be one of a series of reproduced images commissioned and blessed by Pope Leo XIII, depicting the Veil of Veronica. This is the cloth used to wipe Jesus' face before his crucifixion.
I've lived here for about 17 years. It's been in there, either in there or in my bedroom, ever since.
Reports indicate the East Tennessee church, where the thief is alleged to have attempted to sell the stolen painting, had been working with the Vatican to verify the work's authenticity. Unfortunately, this is where our story goes cold. No follow-up stories by the local news, no statements made by church officials, and the man the painting belonged to has since passed away. Maybe it really doesn't matter what the item actually is, but what the item represents. Like the vial from the Church of the Holy Blood and other religious artifacts, real or not, are better represented by the idea they convey. Whether or not they're real may not be as important. We can always hope that they're real, or maybe that's just where faith comes in. For RTN Theology, I'm Ian Skotte.
You have chosen wisely.
Thank you for joining us today on RTN Theology. We'll be back next month with a very special episode. First, I want to thank Jeff Crawford and the Gathering Church for the music for today's episode, featuring the song The Man from Jerusalem, which was written by Seth Pierce, and he's backed up by the great musicians at the Gathering Church. Until next time, take care.
May we go